Welcome to the Science and Magic podcast, Kevin. I'm so excited to have you here. It has been a long time coming, and finally we're making it happen.
Yeah, no, I'm loving this. I'm really been looking forward to talking to you.
Beautiful. So I always like to start these conversations with my guests from the perspective of who you are versus then just only what you do. So I'd like to start briefly by talking about your upbringing.
Mm.
If there's anything you feel pulled to share from your childhood or how or where you were raised, and maybe how that's contributed to your journey today. I know it's a big question, but I find it's a really beautiful way to start in forming connection between guests and listeners.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think it's relevant because we're here to talk about trauma today, right? And I call myself a somatic experiencing practitioner. I'm not a therapist. But I think anybody in this line of work comes to it generally with some experience. So I had some trauma in childhood, right? And that was fundamentally an orientation that I didn't think would bring me into a place where I really get to enjoy talking about this stuff and engage with it. But
Mhm.
it's certainly a starting place for a lot of people who come to this work. I also had a lot of resource back then, but I guess what I have learned from engaging in this over time is that having that trauma pattern is something that sets your nervous system. And I think we're going to talk about that, but it sets up your nervous system to process the world in a certain way.
Mhm.
And I have been becoming more and more aware of that as I learn more about how the nervous system works and how trauma moves in the body. And it's really a process of um, owning the things that have happened. Because a lot of times when trauma is going on, it's not something that anyone looks forward to. It's not something you'd wish on anybody. But I have gotten to a place where I would not want to be without it because of who it's made me. And
Mhm.
that's a really amazing place to get to through all the work that entails you have to do when you've had something like that start out your life. That was
Mhm.
a little vague. I don't know if you need something that's a little deeper, but I think
Mhm.
that's an
It,
important piece.
it's both vague and deep.
Yeah,
And I love the perspective shift on you feeling grateful for the trauma that you've experienced and that it's helped you
exactly.
land to where you are.
Exactly. And I don't want to minimize people's pain around this stuff because it's for a long time it's really hard to have that as a background, right? And it still is. It's not something I'd maybe choose for anyone else, but I love who I am now. And if
Mhm.
I love who I am now, I have to love what made me. And that's, I think, finding that in my bones has been what this process has been about. And it's what I now share with people who I work with.
And what's amazing is I met you years ago and you helped me process through the trauma of losing my father at an early
Yeah.
age.
Yeah.
And I wasn't seeking you out necessarily for that. It was for Rolfing,
Mm-hmm.
hands-on body work.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you had gone through your training in somatic experience education.
No.
And yet that was so a part of your path. And
Yeah.
it spurred my path in a lot of ways, but it's just in your spirit. It's in your bones, this offering of helping people to understand and integrate and live with trauma and pain and the things that are hard to experience in life.
Right. And that's the neat thing about this orientation from the body up rather than the mind down, if that's an appropriate
Mhm.
encapsulation of it. But you get to see how people's lives shape them. Rolfing to me was learning about how bodies are shaped, how they relate to each other in the world. And then when you start to add trauma to that, it makes you see how that shape exists in movement, in real life, in relationship, and you start to be able to work with that. And this trauma thing is just in a continuation of that process, which has just been the biggest joy of my life to be able to see how this process informed that and how that process informs this. It's just a big web that we're getting to explore and I think widen as we understand more.
It really is. And I feel like through my mentorship with you, through Rolfing, I was able to understand how trauma actually shows up in a session.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that is a bodywork session, whether it's working with my clients, whether it's in a yoga room, it's present. And you have helped me to be more accepting of the trauma in my body and understand how to be with that, which has in turn allowed me to hold space for trauma to show up and be held by the people who I'm holding space for. And I'm so excited to get into this with you during this conversation because it has been life-changing for me and I feel so grateful. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit about what a session with you looks like and how it might be different than talk therapy. Because when I share somatic experience therapy, it's a bit like Rolfing, where people are like, what is it?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, it's been a moving target. I remember back when you and I were working together, I swore I would never, ever work online with anybody because how can you do anything if you're not in the room? And now COVID happened and I am happily ensconced in my basement talking to people all day. It's like there's a million different ways to do this, but the way that it looks like right now, I have kind of a hybrid practice. I see people in person and online, but fundamentally, I'm interested in hearing how a person is relating to their day. I'm just asking people like, what's going on with you? How does it feel this week? And then I watch people's bodies and I'm looking for those little spikes of activation. Right. And sometimes these things are good. Like people are talking about their day and they had a really good thing and something happened and you can see their systems light up. And the neat thing about the nervous system, that's exactly the same system that's lighting up there than as it is when you're lighting up in trauma. It's the context around that lighting up that is the thing we have to start processing. So then somebody comes in, generally they're not coming in because they're having great days. So they're coming in because there's some problem and they start talking about it and their system reacts. My job as a body worker, that is not about psychotherapy, is to stop people. I'm a rude listener. I interrupt people all the time and I tell them, hang on, let's notice what you felt there. And a lot of times it's something that people just plow through. But when you give it a little time and you let it expand, you start to get a sense that there is something here. There's some more information. There's something to relate to. Oh, I remember what this feeling is. And I remember feeling that back then. And that really hurt. That really sucked. I don't want to think about that. And your body has been protecting you for a long time. And so you move through those periods of activation without trying to pay any attention to them. But when we can do it in a supported space, and it doesn't have to be in person, it can be online, or I've done it over the phone, right? It's just being with a person without any fear in yourself, because you've processed that yourself and you understand what safety feels like. So you can maintain safety while somebody else is in a scary place. And you let them experience that intensity and then the experience of coming down from that intensity, and all in one continuous loop. People normally get stuck at that intensity and then they just stay there and then they run or they fight or they freeze. That's that fight, fight, freeze response. And then they get stuck in those. And so you get people who are frozen all day long and they just don't want to feel anything, or you get people who are angry all the time and they can't get away from their anger. People who run from every situation. Those are psychological aspects, but they're fundamentally physiological reactions. My job is to sort out the physiology that underlies the psychology. I leave the psychology to the therapist and I love them for it. And I try to work through the body so that the body feels safer while it's doing its work.
It's body up, and
it's body up.
Not necessarily processing the trauma through the storytelling of it or the recollection of the memory, but the sensations in real time,
right.
And helping your clients feel safe in those sensations, or creating a space where they can listen to those sensations and allow them to move. Is that
exactly? And once the body, what you realize is that most people's bodies are trying to fix things all the time, right? That's what a postural fixation is. Somebody who's got hunched shoulders, or somebody who's feels tightness all the time. Their body's doing their best. It's not a problem. And if you address it as a problem, you keep pushing at something that isn't going to move, or that doesn't want to move, because it feels like it's keeping the body safe. But so I take people in, especially in the early sessions when we're just getting to know their trauma, and we say, oh, you look hunched, and that looks like your body's really working hard at that. What if we help it? And I'll have them pull a blanket around their shoulders or take their sweater and just pull it tight. And as they do that and they help their body do what it's been trying to do for years, it's a great relief. And it's this counterintuitive movement into the thing your body's been trying to do, which has felt scary, right? I don't want to be locked up. I don't want to be tight. I want to be open and loose and free and easy. And why can't I do it? I drop my shoulders every day, right? But it's, if you can work with your body to give it what it's asking for, which is safety, compression, tension, there's a natural expression of expansion that comes after that. You have to let the body complete the action it's looking for to stay safe. And when it feels that safety, then it says, of course, now I want to go eat everything and sit on the beach all day, right? Like, it's that expression of natural life that comes back into people's bodies after they've gone into the place that they've been avoiding for all those years. Make sense?
Totally. This is
Yeah.
why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because you
Yeah.
have a way of articulating these things that feel relatable. And one of my passions is bringing the experience of the nervous system into the application of human life and the application of the
Yeah.
body in real time, rather than just kind of in the head on diagrams on paper. You do
Right.
such a good job of it. Um,
It's so fun.
yeah. And I often give this analogy when talking about emotions or sensations that might be hard to experience, of like, imagine that you invite your friend in for, tea, and they're having a bad day, and you're sitting on the couch and you're listening, but you're kind of like, oh, I'm ready for her to like, or them to like get out. Like you want to usher them out of the door, and there's this energy in your system, and it just, nothing really moves. They don't feel heard. Or maybe you try to fix them, you try to give them some advice, and that's not really making them feel heard. And so they leave not really feeling heard, or like things didn't move. But
Right.
these sensations or these emotions, if given the proper space, and if we're supported, can be the listeners of those, so that they leave, or they're not at the front door banging, locked out in the cold, wanting to come in, that they feel heard and listened, and that there can be softening. And I'm
Yeah.
kind of hearing you say that it's about creating the container, the safety, the support. And we'll talk about that, to let these things, to go into them, to hear them, to listen, and then let them shift in their own
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and just to play with that, like I have that same reaction when somebody comes into my office or is on my screen. There's always a part of me still, after doing this for I don't know how many years now, that tightens and says, "Ooh, what am I going to do? Oh, shoot, am I going to be able to help this person?"
Mhm.
And I remind myself constantly that this person got to my door already. This person is a walking success story.
Oh,
Every person who's breathing has made it through so much hardship, right? And if you trust that they have been able to do that now, then you know that they're going to be able to leave your door and do the same. Your job is to be somewhere in that stream of health, uh, feeling safe and listening by opening. And so all I sit here and do in my office all day long is remember I have a spine and I feel better when I rest into it. And
uh-huh.
I literally sit back in my chair. And this is what you can do with friends on the couch is you sit back into that couch and you feel, oh, this couch feels great. I actually feel really good sitting here. And if I'm going to sit here and feel good, it's going to make it a lot easier for me to open up to my friend. And they're going to be able to find that goodness in themselves because it's not gone. It's just been overshadowed by intensity. All you
Mm.
got to do is weather that storm, and there's always sunshine on the other side.
And this approach of seeing activation as a way that we've coped, and that it's actually incredibly intelligent. I think
Yes.
that's a really important shift. There's nothing wrong. It actually shows resilience.
Yes. Yes. It's called self-love. And even when you're feeling horrible and you don't have any of that laying around, as long as you understand your body's doing its best, that's a start.
Yeah. I love it. Well, before we get into the conversation around trauma, what it looks like, how it shows up in the body, I want to touch in on the nervous system.
Mhm.
The nervous system is talked about more and more and more in our current society, and I think this is great. I think we all need more dialogue around nervous system care. But I'm wondering, let's say an alien asked you, "What is a nervous system?"
Mm.
How would you talk about it? Just kind of like at a base level, in a non pulling terms from, peer reviewed
Yeah.
scientific articles, but
Keep it simple.
yeah.
No, absolutely. And that's a neat thing. You can be very profound here without complicating things.
Yeah.
And the neat thing about it to me is that psychology is boundless, right? There's a million reactions to everything, but
Yeah.
everybody has the same nervous system. And I
Yeah.
talk about specifically my paradigm is the autonomic nervous system,
Mhm.
which I can speak better to than something like the cognitive or higher brain functions. But the autonomic nervous system, is it okay to name this right
Yes.
here?
Yep. Yep.
This is the part of us that just operates all day long. We don't have to think about it. I call it my animal body, right?
Mhm.
And when you relate to animal bodies are like, I think about my work as like taming squirrels, right? Every squirrel in the world acts the same. You run at that squirrel, it runs away.
Yeah.
You run at a person with some trauma in their system, and they're probably going to run away from you,
Yeah.
or they're going to fight you. So you better be ready, right? But so everybody has this programming inside them, and that's due to the way their nervous system is built. That's why excitement and
Mhm.
nervousness are the same thing. it's activation in that nervous system, and it's just something that you can start to predict. And what I love about trauma work is that it gave me the predictive capacity to look at somebody and say, oh, you're reacting in one of these three stages. You're in fight, flight, freeze, or collapse, right? These are really the four levels of the autonomic nervous system response to threat, right? And if you can see that and you can help somebody feel that their nervous system is predictable, it has a pathway that everybody's follows, and that if I understand mine, I can help you understand yours. It stops being this thing that's so multifaceted you can't get your head around it, or something that feels like it's torturing you because you're having panic attacks and you're stuck in them. Well, you're having panic attacks because your system's stuck at a certain level in that nervous system, and you can work with it. You now have a handle to see something bigger, see around something that feels so big that it's overwhelming you. There's always more benefit and more information, and it doesn't have to be complex.
Yeah, this idea of these like three levels of what happens. I'm wondering if you could just give a brief overview of, because we've heard, fight, flight, rest and digest, freeze. You can maybe pull in the sympathetic, parasympathetic, just to give a sort of framework for people listening, because these words are, I feel like they are used a lot in the wellness industry and the coaching industry, and it helps. One of the ways I start with my clients is just offering like what this is, just so we have a common language.
Yeah. So I'll make this as simple as I can. It's the biggest memorization piece you have to have is sympathetic means up and parasympathetic means down, right? So sympathetic means, and you can think of it like the mnemonic of like, I'm sympathetic, I'm feeling what that other person's feeling. As I'm feeling it, they're going up and I'm going up with them, right? Sympathetic nervous system is you doing that to your environment. There's something I think that is dangerous, right? I think I see a tiger, and that sympathetic response is the first thing that's going to happen, right? The parasympathetic response is what comes on either healthfully right away, which is checking in with your friend and saying, hey, did you hear that tiger? Do you think it's a tiger? And they say, no. Oh, okay, I'm going to calm down. That's a healthy parasympathetic response. See how it goes down, right? But there's also something that happens after I've gone all the way, like tiger, tiger, tiger. Then at some point, if I don't think there's anything I can do, the best thing I have to do is freeze. And that's where the parasympathetic comes back. So it's like, if I can get a little bit of threat and resolve it, whew, that's a healthy parasympathetic. If there's more of a threat, then I get into my sympathetic. How do I get out of here? How do I fight this off? And if I can't do either of those things, then I go into my unhealthy or my lizard brain parasympathetic. And that's freeze and then eventually collapse, right? Freeze just being, I don't know what to do. I can't do anything. And collapse is, there's nothing I can do. I give up. I'm in the jaws of the tiger and I might as well just not feel anything, and off I go, right? And people experience all these different stages, and they can do so sequentially, but they can also do these at individual levels. And each of these has a place where the nervous system can come back into equilibrium. And equilibrium is a balance generally between parasympathetic and sympathetic, right? It's not, there's not one worse than the other. Sympathetic gets you out of bed in the morning. Parasympathetic helps you digest and sleep, right? So these are healthy, normal parts of your nervous system. It's just in trauma, we take them to extremes.
And I love that you're sharing that there's kind of healthy ways to experience them and more imbalanced ways, because I think a lot of the dialogue can be, oh, sympathetic bad, which is the up, the activation is bad, and the parasympathetic good. Now, I think we live in a society that reveres the sympathetic and actually turns up the volume a lot on the sympathetic. So creating spaces for the parasympathetic to, recalibrate and to have a little bit more space can be healthy. But what are some examples of a healthy expression of a sympathetic, and then maybe a more imbalanced, and same with the parasympathetic? Because sympathetic gives you energy. I mean, it's like life force,
Exactly. And that's where, like, contextually, excitement is an activation process, right? I don't know if this is too forward for your listeners, but something like sex is a really good way to talk about this.
Yeah.
Is that fit?
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Sex is fascinating because it requires enough parasympathetic activation to say, I'm safe. I feel good here. I
Uh-huh.
want to relax and open up my vulnerable and be vulnerable, be socially engaged with this person.
Mhm.
But I find this person sexy. I'm like interested in them. That's sympathetic. So there's these always this little interplay between I feel good, and when I feel good, I get to feel excited, and I interpret that excitement as a good thing. And then that excitement goes away as I relax after and I have a sense of completion or satiety or ease or all the things that we associate with like, oh, I'm so glad I did that. Right. That's allowing the sympathetic to come online. It's allowing the parasympathetic to moderate our threat response. And it's a way of showing that there's a balance in between the two that is really healthy. Now, anywhere in that, if it gets complex, if there's trauma, any one of those things can take over and run the show. And that's the balance that we're trying to help improve when we have somebody coming in with some kind of issue.
Yeah, wonderful. And just to bring it really back into the body and the personal experience, signals of a sympathetic nervous system would be like increased heart rate,
Mhm.
shortness of breath.
Yeah, sweating, dry mouth.
Mhm.
Uh, some people have racing thoughts,
Mhm.
hyper vigilance, right? Where is their danger? Where is their danger? Looking all over the place. It can have long-term effects like high blood pressure, uh, all kinds of nervous system disorders, anxiety and eventually depression and all those kinds of things.
Mhm.
And then parasympathetic signs, right, are
Mhm.
like um, in the healthy range, it's re-regulation, right? I look at your face and you're familiar, and I have a lot of good associations with you, so my heart rate slows, and
Mhm.
my digestion begins to go more readily. My muscle tone softens, my eyes dilate, uh, my system finds itself at a lower ebb energetically. And then sometimes when it goes too far, it's I become numb, I become frozen, I become depersonalized, dissociated. Like I start like feeling separate from myself or separate from my experiences. So there's two poles to that way that parasympathetic activation can go, and there's really just one for that sympathetic activation.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think that it's so helpful to know the sensations that are
Mhm.
associated with these. So for me, I can track my system at various points throughout the day, and I
Mhm.
just take it in as information. There's not a judgment around it. I can say,
Yeah.
oh, interesting, I'm activated right now. But it creates a consciousness because, yes, we are more than these bodies. I believe that's a personal belief. But I also think, as you said, we all have nervous systems. So it's
Yeah.
integrating this spirit, this energy into the fact that the energy is flowing through a system that has a physical body that's been designed to survive physically throughout all these years. So knowing these signals and signs is like, in my opinion, one of a huge step in feeling empowered in some of this information.
And often what happens with prolonged sympathetic activation, for example, is that people feel really isolated. If you're on the lookout all the time, you end up having to check everything out, and it feels like nothing else is paying as much attention as you are. And so that ends up feeling like you're alone or you're by yourself. And this is where lots of the kind of psychology of trauma comes in. When you feel more safe in your healthy parasympathetic, you
Mhm.
start to feel like you're part of something bigger. You start to feel like you can engage with your environment safely, and it lets you spread out your attention and awareness.
Mm.
And it's a spiritual process to engage deeply in trauma work. It just
Mhm.
has both poles. You can go into one and you can go into the other. And in the end, they're both good, but we need to have the ability to shift between them at will.
Yes. Yeah. The ability to shift between them at will. That is
Yeah.
key.
Yeah.
I heard you say that recognizing my face created a parasympathetic response for you. So something that I learned about after my college years of studying neuroscience and more of the alternative health modalities and deepening into nervous system studies is about the social nervous system. So I'm wondering if you can just touch briefly on that. Like, what is it? How have we been adapted to connect to each other socially? And then how can we utilize it to create more balance in the system?
I love this. Yes. So the only sciencey term I'll throw out there, but just so people can look it up if they want, is the polyvagal theory. Is something put out by a man named Stephen Porges, Porges, and he kind of started studying how the healthy parasympathetic and the more trauma-based parasympathetic reactions go. So all this social engagement happens on this healthy parasympathetic, and it's something new in
Mhm.
evolutionary terms. It's the we call it dorsal vagal. Sorry for the terminology, but dorsal vagal is lizard brain. Dorsal vagal is pull into your back. Like dorsal means back of the body, right? Pull into your back, hide, don't let anybody see you, right? That's how a lizard survives, by being still. That's how you can think about it. This healthy social engagement is that mammalian, like, I'm looking at your face and you look chilled out and happy. That makes me chilled out and happy. What
Yeah.
a nice thing. And so we developed this deeply complex set of facial muscles. In Rolfing, we talk about the only muscles in the body that aren't gravitational response muscles, that aren't there for just keeping us upright, are our arms, which is how we either pull in the world or we push it out, and our
Uh-huh.
faces, which communicate how we're feeling about the world and ourselves. So we have this beautifully complex thing. I, my son is obsessed with reptiles. There's one lizard in the world that can move its upper lip, and it looks really weird when it does it.
Yeah.
We have, like, I don't know what, 30 something muscles that help us move our lips around, right? So my social engagement system is all about reading the situation by reading other people. And when the situation is healthy and good and the other people are there and they're feeling good, I'm naturally going to flow with that. And that's one of these group instincts. We call it social grooming, where you get to have a lot of positive interactions and it increases your own internal health.
Mhm.
um Social engagement also has a negative, right, which is, I can, as especially with a person with trauma, I can really read into somebody's facial expressions. I
Mhm.
use this professionally because I have this incredible ability to track people's movements and emotions before they know they have them, right?
Yeah.
But for me, it's now a skill because I've been able to work with it and it feels safe and it feels good.
Yeah.
When it's something that you're being forced into because your nervous system is saying danger, 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 you look at somebody's face and you may interpret a sign that's not there. Something like anger passing over somebody's face feels really threatening to you, whereas another person who's feeling safer, is just a question like, oh, what happened there?
Mhm.
So social engagement is this really fascinating way in which we help our nervous systems regulate, and ideally it happens all the way before all this fight, flight, freeze, collapse aspects. It's where we are working with other humans at our best capacity, and it's what we turn to first whenever there's an issue.
Mhm. And it reminds me of like how cozy I feel with my loved ones and
Yeah.
how that can really help to me to feel more balanced in my body. And at the same time, if I'm feeling extra activated going to a social event or a networking event with a lot of strangers, knowing that could add to the activation. And I hear this a lot, that people feel really uncomfortable going into a room full of strangers. Not everybody. I mean, there's some people who are really extroverts, is what they say, and that feeds them, but it can be very triggering. And
Mhm.
maybe it's too much information, or maybe the system, your nervous system is reading into all these faces and it becomes overwhelming. I think this is just like a big, interesting piece of the nervous system that I find fascinating. It could be a whole podcast.
Yeah, no, it really. But I think a lot of this too is just pointing out how contextual these signals are.
Yeah.
Same thing with pain in the body and
Yeah.
this kind of stuff. Like a pain, generally we think about it as damage, like, oh, something's wrong,
Yeah.
but it's just information. And when our system is feeling good and we get a little pinch, no big deal. It's when our bodies are scared that, oh, that pinch means something's really wrong. So
Right.
the same thing when you go into a crowd, it's, if I'm feeling nervous about going, it is 9 times more likely to
Uh,
feel nervous as soon as I get there and start reading people's faces. They don't want to see me. They don't like me. I don't feel heard. I don't feel seen. Whereas, and I'm going to share this with you just because I use it so often, but I have rocks that I hand out to all my
mhm.
clients. And it's, let's orient your nervous system to when you feel best. And then let's hold that rock and believe that this rock is going to remind me of that. So when you walk into that crowd, you have a way to connect back to that feeling of things are okay and I'm at ease. Because those faces can turn from negative or nervous to warm and welcoming just by changing the context in your head. And sometimes we just need a little magic talisman or a rock to help us get there. But however you get there, it's just recognizing that you have some power over the context. And if you can't change it, it's probably trauma or something along those lines that needs some support.
I love how you pulled in some magic to the science. But this is
There's always
funny.
some. Yes.
This is funny because look what I always have at my desk, a rose quartz.
There you go.
And I have gotten more and more at ease over time having public dialogue and being on camera and filming myself. But there are times where I actually just intuitively grab for this rock while I'm having these conversations and I just hold it. So that is fascinating to me that you hand those out to your clients.
Great minds think alike, right?
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about stress now. So
Okay.
stress is also a hot topic, and it's something that I think every single person to some degree runs up against in some way. So before the concept of talking about trauma, let's just talk about stress, stressors. How does stress impact the nervous system? How would you describe it to the aliens?
Good question. So again, this may start sounding like a broken record, but I think stress is again a part of the information our bodies are taking in. And what happens with stress is information, right? And stress for most people, and I would say a general definition, is something that causes, I don't know what you want to call it, pain, difficulty, friction in the body is kind of the way I think about it. With more stress, there's more friction and it makes it harder to engage in the ways we would choose to if we had the option.
Mm-hmm.
So, to the aliens, stress is something our bodies are made to manage. And that's why we have an autonomic nervous system. It's when we compile stress, we don't get away from it, when it shifts our baseline of relative ease to relative anxiety, because we're just trying to manage all the inputs coming in. That's where stress becomes an actual problem. Otherwise, a little bit of stress in the system, it's stressful to wake up. And if you can meet that stress with a little activation and a little coffee, bam, your nervous system starts working the way it is meant to. Stress is something that has driven our species to be what we are. It's not inherently bad.
Yeah.
It's just the way that we engage with it at this point is not healthy. And I think trauma, and this is my bias, but I think trauma helps us take in stress in ways that are not productive, whereas otherwise we'd be able to roll with it. Trauma says there's already a set point of trouble here, and with more intensity, more intense information, I'm going to be in more trouble. And that's how we have to help people.
Mm. Ugh, our bodies were built to handle stress.
Yes.
Just
Absolutely.
taking that in and feeling the robustness and the empowerment in that statement, because it can feel crippling. And also, there's a lot of language around stress is a killer, like things like that. Stress actually can make us incredibly strong. It's like you stress the muscles to build the muscles. You stress your cardio system to increase cardio. And I think rather than be scared of all the stress we're experiencing, shifting to that empowered lens is so helpful.
I love that. Yes.
Yeah. So then is trauma an accumulation of too much stress? Will you share how you speak about trauma?
I mean, that's not a bad way to say it. I think of trauma as stress that becomes overwhelming in our capacity to process it in the moment we're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is if I get into a stressful encounter and I can run away or I can push it away, that's generally what I would consider a successful stress encounter, because it means you encountered an obstacle, you were able to engage that obstacle in a meaningful way, and you were able to feel safe afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of issues are not traumatic, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
What becomes traumatic is when I encounter some kind of stress that I perceive as dangerous or life-threatening. And this is not realistic. This is a perception, right? Driving a car is normal for some people and life-threatening for others in their perception. When that experience, whatever it is, becomes overwhelming, our body stops being able to manage it in real time, meaning it can't respond with a useful response, and it stops, generally with freeze. And that's, again, based on the nervous system, not based on choice, right? And it means that at some point, we have to continue to move in spite of that freeze, and we create compensating mechanisms. So I figure out, that really didn't feel good. I hate how this networking meeting made me feel, and I am never going back to one. Right? That's basically a trauma response. It's maybe trauma light, and this is where we run into the issue that trauma is a generic term for a lot of different experiences. But let's take the networking thing and say that's a little bit of a trauma experience, and it's not just because there were a lot of people there. It's because the way I felt when I was with all those people is a way I never want to feel again.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma is always a response to the emotion we had in response to the event. It is not about the event itself. This is why a car accident is not traumatic to everybody in the car all the time. It's just traumatic to the person who didn't like their emotional response to that car accident. Does that make sense?
It
That's why
does.
you can have a million different responses and a million different people. Some of them will be traumatic and some not.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then our way of helping people work through that is simply to see what they're compensating with, right? And that is, I don't get in cars anymore, or I don't go to networking meetings anymore, or every time I get near a networking meeting, I get a headache, or every time I see that person at the networking meeting, I hide, right? These are all compensation patterns, and some of them are useful and they last for a lifetime, but some of them become problematic, and that's where trauma gets stuck in the body. And by stuck in the body, I don't mean in the tissues, I mean in our associations in our nervous system.
Mhm. Do you think that I have a question about the where trauma stems from? Because I find that a lot of people have trauma from their childhood, that maybe spurs into more traumatic events in their adulthood. Within your clients, do you find that I mean, I know you don't work through stories, but like the situations where trauma is stored in their body stems from childhood? Because I feel like in childhood, you don't have a lot of choice often. You're at the whim of your primary care providers. And if it's not a safe experience in so many ways, physically, emotionally, then that could create patterns of survival and stored trauma. So what sort of, I don't want to like put it so calculated as percentage, but childhood trauma versus adult trauma, like, is there a difference that you see in your practice?
So it is a great question. We call, just to differentiate them, we call early childhood trauma attachment trauma,
Okay.
generally speaking. And that's generally where it's related to a caregiver. And we call other kinds of trauma, things like car accidents or things like sudden events even for children, acute trauma. So there's attachment trauma and acute trauma. When I'm working, so somatic experiencing is functionally a shock trauma or acute trauma method, right? And so when I came out of SC, I was thinking, I'm going to work on a lot of people with car accidents. I'm going to fix them, right? And what happens is, as you start to work with acute trauma, you see that almost always underneath is some level of attachment trauma. So I would say, in terms of percentages, I don't know if this is totally fair, and this is not scientific. It's just my experience. And I have a very select population I'm pulling from who are coming to me because I say trauma all the time. But I'd say it's about 100%. I don't think you have much acute trauma without some attachment trauma.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
yeah, that's a sense I was feeling into too.
Right. And it's functionally, we talk about attachment trauma as like the kindling and acute trauma being the match.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so if acute trauma happens in somebody who really truly hasn't had attachment trauma, they're going to have a more resilient nervous system and generally a healthier baseline that we can return to relatively easily. And the example of that is, like, when I've had that in my practice, it is 2 or 3 sessions of straight SE and we're done. But for the majority, and I would say 90% of my clients, 98% of my clients, it is actually the shock of the acute trauma that brings them in, and it is the work on the attachment trauma that gets them better. And one tends to help people realize they had the other. Most of us are like, I had a decent childhood. I'm okay. And functionally, what that means is I don't perceive harm in that space. But when I got into this car accident, I lost my mind and I don't know why. And
Mm-hmm.
in part, we can then trace that back to, well, I didn't feel cared for or safe. Oh, and then where else did you feel that? Well, not all the time, but sometimes my parents were busy. They were at work a lot. And I just got into stuff and I got overwhelmed. And that didn't feel like trauma before then, but after this car accident, it really feels a little bothersome. And now we have something to work on that's both early in life and in the moment. And I think that's a longer process, that's not a bad thing, but it is something that helps people really deeply move through their trauma into their health rather than thinking they have to just fix it, get it done, and be done.
Yeah, move through their trauma, integrate it and into health, and see the health in the way trauma is showing up in a way, because the body's adapted in these ways to those experiences. So there is an inherent health. I remember I learned that in my craniosacral program, and it just blew my mind. It was like, this is actually, there's nothing wrong in the system. This is a sign of health that this pattern is here. And it's not maybe a match to the environments that we're experiencing. And this is where that interception and getting the support can help to process, but loving that part of yourself, that's that self-love of like, I'm not broken. I don't need to be fixed. Like I'm resilient.
Right.
That messaging is,
It's huge. And it's something everybody, I think, in trauma land has to find, because the experience generally is not coming from a sense of resilience. And that's the trick of it, right? That's why this messaging is so important, that resilience and health is inherent. And it's also important for people who have no idea what that's like to realize that it's underneath, and it's generally unconscious. It doesn't mean it's gone.
yeah. You mentioned some signs. So if someone's listening to this and they're like, oh, interesting. I wonder, I'm bustling through life and just kind of living in autopilot, but I'm thinking trauma might have a role in how I'm interacting with life. What are some signs that it might be present in someone's experience?
So this is funny, but I think it's lack of joy. Lack of joy and lack of spontaneous gratitude. The thing trauma robs us of is not just we think of it as feeling low, but it's also about not being able to reach high. And that's because as we get and accumulate more negative experiences, we have to live in a space that's safe. And so it shrinks our window. We call it an somatic experiencing, the window of tolerance. Having a smaller window of tolerance makes life livable for people, but it also shows up as loss or lack of joy, goodness, as well as a little flattening of the negative, pain, disruption. So loss of joy, that's the one that's there for real subtle signs. Like when people say, I'm okay, I just don't know why I'm not happier. A lot of times I think that's where the hidden trauma is.
Yeah.
For people who are exacerbated, and these are the people who come into my practice generally, who know they have some kind of trauma. There, it's more along the lines of, I'm having mood swings that are not from some diagnosed mental health issue. I'm having relationship issues that I can't resolve, that don't seem to be about who did the dishes, but that's what I'm arguing about, but I'm just angry all the time. It's I can't live my life because I don't feel like I'm a part of it. It's saying I'm distanced, I'm dissociated. Those are all signs of that fight, flight, or freeze system getting stuck at one of those points. So you can look in yourself and see, does that feel true? Am I running from everything? Am I fighting everything? Am I freezing in the face of everything? Those are the hard trauma signs. The easier ones are those lack of joy and things like that.
Yeah, the living in autopilot, I feel like is such a common experience in modern society, of just like waking up and going through the motions. And even if I've hit all my milestones and reached all my goals and all the things I want, something's missing. And it might be that some trauma is present and hasn't been listened to and processed and heard. So that's just important information. Again, I think it's empowering just to have this knowledge and this conscious interaction with life. It can be very helpful, because it's disempowering. You're like, something's wrong. I don't know what it is. Something's wrong with me and I'm just flatlined.
Or I feel directionless. I just don't know what to do with myself. That's a normal experience, but it also sometimes is exacerbated because you can't feel the pull of life inside of you.
Yeah. Oof. Can't feel the pull of life inside of you. Yeah, that's a big one. I want to touch on anxiety and depression. I know that these, mental disorders impact many people, and either personally or perhaps, loving someone who's suffering from one of these conditions. So I really resonate with how you talk about both of these things. And from a somatic perspective, how would you talk about them? I know it's a big question, but just kind of briefly touching from that body up perspective versus a condition.
And I'll be clear that the way I'm talking about anxiety and depression is not from a psychotherapy realm, right? Because I'm obviously not qualified in that. But the way I see it in response to trauma as a coping pattern, right? Depression is a way to feel less. And in that, it's our body doing its best to help us when we're feeling too much. So to me, depression is an adaptive response, and it's doing its best to help us. And it means that there's a strong emotion in there somewhere that we don't want to feel. And so our body says, I got you. You're not going to feel anything. And it happens that we lose all the highs in addition to the lows we're avoiding. That's kind of what we were just talking about. So depression is oftentimes supported through doing some work with those big emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Anxiety is what's left over sometimes when those big emotions are up in the world, like you can feel big emotions, but you don't have anything to like point at. You're saying, I feel bad about everything, or everything scares me. And it's like, well, I know I was scared of something. I know when somebody comes in the room, I'm scared of them, or I know when that work assignment comes, I'm scared of that. But in otherwise, I'm just feeling generally free floating, like something's wrong and I don't know what, and I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. So
Mm-hmm.
anxiety is that adaptive response of, if you can keep your eyes open, you'll be the one to see the tiger first. But it means you can only sleep with one eye open,
Mm.
right? You have to sleep with one eye open. It's not a adaptive response for the long term, but it's again your body doing its best to keep you safe when it doesn't know what's wrong, but thinks there's something going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that depression is an overexpression of the parasympathetic nervous system and anxiety is more of that sympathetic, or is that too?
You could, but I hesitate because people within I think of depression as like tight shoulders,
Yeah.
right? Depression is an adaptation to a nervous system that's off balance, and so it's doing its best, but it's getting stuck,
Okay.
right? Because people with depression have sympathetic and parasympathetic activation all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're not they're not losing aspects of that. It's more that they've adapted themselves to a certain way of being in the world that manages that up and down of parasympathetic and sympathetic.
Okay. Yeah. And what would you, so if someone's listening and they feel like, okay, for sure there's trauma present in my life, or I experience anxiety often throughout my day, or I'm feeling stuck and depressed, like what's one thing to just start with right now? And maybe even aside from, hiring support,
Yeah, yeah.
because sometimes that's intimidating,
Oh, totally,
with money and investment, and sometimes it's not possible for folks. So what's just something to
totally.
feel like, okay, I can do something. I'm empowered.
So one of the things our brains do better with is identifying the source of a problem.
Mhm.
And so depression and anxiety feel really open, generalized everywhere, right? My whole life I'm depressed. But if you start to think about, okay, when I'm depressed, I feel what? And I always ask people to tell me where it is in their body. And
Mm.
generally speaking, somebody's going to feel depression in a single space. And a lot of people like will say it's in my chest. I feel heavy. And that starts to help us localize it. It's like, where's the tiger? Oh, there's the tiger, right? And now I can draw a circle around the tiger. And if I can draw a circle around it in my body, that means I have a whole rest of my body that may be feeling something different. And
Mhm.
if I can find, well, my hips feel really stable today. I'm sitting here, I feel my weight and it feels good. I'm settled in this chair. Well, now you have depression here, but you have settled here. And now you're on your way to figuring out a little bit of balance and a little bit of space where previously you've just been stuck in a morass or stuck in anxietyville. So localize it and then feel something else and then notice what happens in your body.
Localize it, feel something else, and notice what happens in the body.
And
I
the neat
love
thing,
that.
let me just add to it because
Yeah.
then the best part of our nervous system, I love this stuff. Like uh if we can do that, if we can set up a conversation in our body between here's something bad and here's something good, or at least neutral.
Yeah.
I tell people like this, if you're running from a bear and you can stop to smell a rose, at that moment, your body has to go through a new calculation. Am I really being chased by a bear if I can sit here and enjoy this rose? That's feeling your hips. If
Hmm.
I can feel my hips, even though there's this terrifying thing here, that means it must not be as terrifying as I thought. Any sane person does not stop to smell a rose if there's really a bear. So if you can tell your body, it feels like a bear, but there's also a rose, there's something good here, then your body is going to reevaluate your stress response and it's going to almost automatically lower it. So that conversation we're inviting when we present a little bit of difference in the body is an automatic nervous system reset that allows you the space to feel like maybe things aren't as bad as I thought.
Mm.
And as a felt sense, it's not something you have to tell yourself.
Yeah. And I want to kind of start closing this conversation around the rose and that perhaps being resource, if I'm
Yes,
hearing this right.
yes,
And I love how you
absolutely.
talk about resource. I call them yums. My website's Live Deliciously, and I say, what
Yeah,
yums can you invite into your life? And I think pulling in resources can be really helpful as well.
yes. And resources are in your body and they're outside of your body, right? The yums that I think most of us track are people we like, places we like, things we like. What I invite people to do as a body worker is to realize that there are yums even in our worst responses. So I'm going to give you the like 10-second demonstration, but if I'm feeling a lot of fight and I push, that turns into a yum. My fight needs something to do. If I can give myself a fight, the safe one that doesn't fight back, then I get to succeed in that experience.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm feeling like I want to run, allow yourself to get up and move, allow yourself to get up and leave. You can always come back. But if you give your body permission to do the thing it's asking you to do, that turns your negative into a positive. It makes your yuck a yum, if you want to
Yeah.
call it that.
It's following what feels good. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah. As long as it feels safe and
Safe and good.
is in the your best health. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely.
I want to share an excerpt that I pulled from your website.
Okay.
Um, we don't believe trauma to be a life sentence. Rather, it is a window into what it means to be human, to hurt and to heal, to reconnect and reinvest in the feelings and experiences that make life meaningful. And I feel like it's just this acknowledgement that in life, in life, there's rupture and repair, there's tearing and there's mending. Oh, I used
Mm.
mending. I didn't even mean to do that.
Hey.
And I wonder if you might expand on that at all, or if you want to say anything in addition.
I love that. And this is the whole point. There is never anything so broken it can't be fixed. And fixing is not about making it right, it's about making it whole. And it's about recognizing that our wholeness is present in anything we do, especially when it feels like we're stuck or we're lacking or we're losing something.
Mm-hmm.
If you can relate to the parts that exist, both the good and the bad, you're never running away from bad. You're never losing your good. You're encapsulating them as a whole. And that's what human experience is. Rupture and repair is bad and good right next to each other. That's health. That's your nervous system. That's parasympathetic. That's sympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
That's healthy relationship. And it's resilience. It's the ability to be in whatever space you're in with some sense of hope.
What a beautiful way to end. How can
I love it.
listeners connect with you? So if they want to work with you, if you offer anything more public and group, or if it's just one-on-one, what does that look like?
So primarily I work with individuals, and my practice right now is pretty full. So it's not necessarily me that you would have to see, but our website has a lot of resources. We have waiting lists that you can always get on, but
Mhm.
primarily I would say we're looking to help educate um, people who are looking to help. So we're in the process of developing some attachment for couples. My wife is a couples therapist with a trauma emphasis. She's going to be putting out some more blog posts and some things to reference and collate the supplies and resources we have available. So that'll be on our website. And otherwise, just keep tuned in to mendmn.com where we will be posting all this stuff and hopefully expanding our offerings as time presents itself.
Yeah,
But
I've
really,
always,
yeah.
I've always been able to see you doing like group classes and like
Yes, you're good.
workshops, and I'm like just waiting. You're such a natural teacher. And you do have a couple of classes on the Science and Magic portal, the membership portal. If you're
Absolutely.
watching this on YouTube, I'll link one of your videos is on YouTube about trauma, just like a trauma nervous system 101 class.
Yeah,
But I'm just, me, I'm waiting for the time where you host some sort of course or, more generalized. Your
I love
practice
it.
is so needed. Ever since you decided that you wanted to walk this path, like I remember you said to me, I feel like my career is like water flowing down a hill. Like it's so
Yeah.
natural for you. And it's such a gift to help people understand trauma, their nervous system, and for this grounded space that you hold as others dive into their own experience. It's a gift. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to help people heal because we know that everybody who heals helps somebody else.
Oh, I love that.
Thank you, Amanda. It's just such a pleasure.
Thank you.